Hi, I'm Kirsty Hooper, and today I'm going to share with you the story of a little boy called George Satchwell. George lived in the Warwickshire village of Berkswell, and in November 1845, he found himself as a key witness in a murder trial. So let's start with the potted history of the murder, which took place in the farmhouse you can see in the photograph below. On Wednesday, the 19th of November 1845, George's employer, the Berkswell farmer Thomas Tranter, was found dead in his brew house. His skull had been caved in with an axe, which was lying alongside his body. And nobody was ever convicted of the murder, but the culprit was popularly believed to be a local youth called James Reed, who was the son of the village's railway policeman. And Reed was just 18. He was tried and acquitted of murder, but quickly rearrested for larceny. And this time he was found guilty, and after more than 5 years aboard a British prison hulk, he was transported to Tasmania. The case became known as the Berkswell murder. It was exhaustively reported in the local press and even made the national news. The immediate aftermath of the murder itself and the two trials in March and August 1846 were eagerly followed by local newspapers in Coventry, Leamington, Warwick and Birmingham, with many columns given over to more than 30 witnesses, very colourful witness statements they were, including George's own. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is to piece together George's version of events from the newspaper reports of his interviews at the coroner's inquest in Berkswell and later the assizes in Warwick. And I worked with genealogical and topographical sources to identify the people and the places he mentions. And what I'm hoping is that by placing George's story about 4 of the most traumatic days in his short life into their wider community context, we can get some insights not only about the circumstances of Thomas Tranter's murder and the community within which it took place, but also about the daily life of a child farm worker in early Victorian England. So George's story begins shortly before 8 o'clock on the morning of Monday the 17th of November 1845, when he arrived at his master's farmhouse. It was the first day of George's second week working for Thomas Tranter, and he'd made the half-hour walk from his home 2 miles away, which you can see on the map is the little orange house just above my head, carrying his breakfast and lunch in a bag prepared by his mother. George and Tranter had a quick breakfast together, and then at about 8 o'clock, George left Tranter in the kitchen and went out to the barn to get his shovel, his fork, and a little ruck of muck, which his master had told him to spread in the meadow in front of the house. And the photograph you've got on the slide is actually a postcard from about 1906. You can see the farmhouse we're talking about on the left-hand side, and the meadow in front is the meadow where George was working on this day. So not long after he'd gone outside, he said, "My master came to me and assisted me for about 5 minutes. He told me to spread it thinner and then went round by the back gates into the house. I never saw him alive after that." George carried on working in the field all morning until around about 11 or 12 o'clock, when from his position halfway up the field, which is more or less where we're looking from in the picture, he saw a man come out of the front door. He shut it after him and then locked it and put the key in his left-hand trousers pocket before going around to the back of the house. The man was young, wearing a black fur hat and carrying a bundle tied in a blue handkerchief under his left arm. And this man, according to the prosecution, was the accused James Reed. The black fur hat and the bundle were both Tranter's, and it would be Reed's decision to take them to pawn in Birmingham that night that eventually saw him convicted for larceny. After the man had gone, George was hungry. He went back to the house, tried the front door to see if he could get in to find out the time and collect his lunch bag, which he'd left in the kitchen. But the front door was locked, so was the back door, and all of the shutters were closed. George, despite having no lunch, carried on working for a little while, and then he went up the lane to ask Raven's lad for the time. Raven's lad Thomas was 9, like George, and like George, he was working as a farm labourer for his uncle and aunt Henry and Maria Raven, who farmed next door to Tranter. Thomas remembered that he was inside the yard scraping it out. He told George that it was 1 o'clock. And you can actually see the Ravens' barn above my head on the black and white photograph. I tried to recreate the shot, but unfortunately all the new development in the meadow means you can't get the same angle. So that's my attempt to get as close as I possibly can. And if you look all the way in the distance on the right-hand side of the photograph, you can see that same barn, which is still there and is now a rather lovely house. So back in the field, George carried on working alone until 4 p.m. when it started to get dark. He saw another neighbour, Joe Parker, going to fetch his donkey up and asked him if he'd seen his master. He tried the door once more before leaving his fork at the barn and setting out for home, where he saw several more neighbours on his way home and asked all of them if they'd seen his master, but nobody had. When he got home, he told his mum he'd had no victuals all day and went to bed. The next day, Tuesday, George got up at about 5:30, asked his father if he'd seen his master, and made the 2-mile walk through the rain back to Tranter's. Once again, he found the house locked and the barn unlocked, just as they'd been when he left the night before. But he remembered that his master had told him that if it was wet, he was to go into the barn and pull beans. So in he went and remained in the barn, and he said, until it gave over raining, and then went back into the field to spread muck and continued at his work as long as it was light. He went home before it was dark on Tuesday night because he wanted his dinner. The next day, Wednesday, George went back to work after breakfast as soon as it was light, calling in at the rake maker Robinson's on the way to find out if Mr. Robinson had seen his master. So again, on the map on the right, you can see George's house just above my head. You can see Robinson's, the rake maker, just to the left of me. And if you follow the orange line, it takes you up to the black house, which is Tranter's house. And the map on the left is an Ordnance Survey map from 1831, which also has the same route marked on it, just so that you can see how little development, how few houses there were in the area at the time this was all happening. So he arrived at the house to find it still locked, and there was still no sign of Tranter. So George set out over the fields again to Berkswell village, and you can follow his route on the map again, the orange route, all the way across the fields, right up to Berkswell at the very top of the map. And here he went to the forge to see the Whitehead family to find out if there was any fair about or if they knew where his master was. Now, although neither George nor the newspaper reporters mention it, Mrs. Whitehouse was actually Tranter's sister. So John Whitehead, who accompanied George back to the farm, was Tranter's nephew. And George's witness statement ends here, as the adults took over the reporting of events, but we know from their evidence, that he remained on site, watching what unfolded. So when the group arrived back at Tranter's, George waited outside while Whitehead and another of Tranter's nephews, William Good, together with the local constable, climbed in through an upstairs window. And the painting you're looking at now is a painting of the house from the other angle, from round about 1890, but you can see really clearly the big barn to the rear, and you can see the upstairs window on the left-hand side, which is the window that they climbed into. So after a thorough search, they eventually found Tranter's body in the brew house to the rear of the main house. The coroner was called along with a police officer from Coventry. By 10 or 11 o'clock that night, only George and Tranter's 2 nephews were still at the house, and the 3 of them holed up in the kitchen, which is the bottom left-hand window at the front, by the fire, and little George fell asleep. So he missed out on quite a flurry of activity when at about 4 a.m. someone, who was believed to be Reed, the suspect, tried to break in at the front door, and the 2 older men got rather freaked out. The next time we can place George with any certainty is the following Wednesday, the 26th of November 1845, when he was called as a witness at the coroner's inquest at the Bear Inn in Berkswell village, next door to the Whitehead family's forge. So that's all the way at the top of the map up there. You can see the forge and the pub next door to each other. So here's the pub, and this is where the coroner's inquest took place. There were 12 jurymen in attendance, all of them local men who'd have known George well, including Tranter's nearest neighbour, Henry Raven. George, when he was asked his age, proudly declared that I shall be 10 years old in January next. He explained he'd known Tranter for 3 or 4 years and had been working for him 1 week and 1 day before his death. The rather unpopular local vicar, Reverend Sheriff, scoffed at George's evidence, saying he should not believe all this boy said. But the jury disagreed. They had George's back, they encouraged him, and they dismissed Sheriff's marks as uncalled for. George did not long remain in Berkswell. We don't know whether that's due to the trauma of the murder or a simple desire for a greater opportunity, but he became part of the rural migration northwards to the coalfields of North Derbyshire and South Yorkshire, ending up in Mexborough, where he married, raised a family, and died in 1896 at the age of 60. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my talk. What I've tried to do today is to start sketching out the wider social and geographical context for George's story about 4 of the most traumatic days in his short life. And I originally intended to draw some rather dry methodological conclusions, but actually my biggest takeaway from this short project has been the insight into little George's day-to-day life. On the one hand, the really hard physical work and surprising level of independence required of a 9-year-old farm boy. But on the other hand, the evidence of just how easily he moved around the thriving, close-knit networks of his Warwickshire farming community. Thank you very much.